So this very, very brief PowerPoint is going to give you a little overview of the Civil War, just remind you what happened, who won, and then we're also going to take a closer look at Reconstruction and what that looked like in the South, how that ended, and how it affected the South and the nation as a whole. When we complete, or you complete listening to this recording, you should be able to answer these 5 questions. I'm going to read them out loud so that you can read them and process them and be thinking about these questions as you're listening as I go through this PowerPoint. Number 1, blank was the period during which the United States began to rebuild after the Civil War. 2, the blank amendment made slavery unconstitutional. The election of blank as President of the United States ended Reconstruction. Number 4, list one way that Southern states attempted to disenfranchise African Americans. Number 5, blank were a group of African American migrants who fled the South for Kansas in hope of equality. So real quick, let's talk about when the Civil War occurred, why the Civil War occurred. So if you remember anything from 8th grade or your life, you should know that the Civil War is a war that's fought among a nation. So it's not one nation fighting another nation, it's a war within a nation. And the Civil War in the United States was fought primarily over the issue of slavery. The South wanted to keep slavery intact, and they felt threatened that there were some Republican Northerners who were wanting to end slavery. The North looked at the South as having this peculiar institution of slavery. Where you see the slavery in the Western territories, as the United States grew, America had to essentially figure out what to do with these states. Should they be slave states? Should they be free states? And fighting occurred because the South wanted them to be slave states because they'd have more votes on their side in the federal government, and vice versa. Free states wanted them to be free states because they would have votes in the federal government as well. Lincoln runs for president in 1860 as a Republican nominee. Now, Lincoln does not run necessarily as an abolitionist meaning someone who wants to completely eliminate slavery. What Lincoln was against, though, was the spread of slavery. Any territory that was to become a new state, he envisioned that it should be a free state. This worried the South, and they saw and thought that this would be the end of slavery if he was elected. So when Lincoln was elected in 1860, the Civil War started. South Carolina would be the first state to secede, and they would secede on December 20th, 1860. Secede means to withdraw from the United States of America. They see themselves no longer as a member of the United States of America and are starting to form their own country, the United Confederate States. Now, this was followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Arkansas. Now, since we are from Tennessee, a little side note on the state of Tennessee. West Tennessee, whose geography is quite a bit different than East Tennessee, West Tennessee has a flat geography that allowed for a lot more plantations. Where in East Tennessee, it's rocky, it's hilly, it was made of poor Appalachian farmers who couldn't afford slaves. So when the Civil War started, many East Tennesseans supported the North, and many West Tennesseans supported the South. The state almost split in two because of this, because of the East support for the North and the West support for the South. But instead, as a whole, they seceded from the Union. Now, Virginia was not as attempted to not split, but did. Western Virginia, also a rocky, hilly area, Appalachian, not a lot of plantation owners, a lot of poor farmers, supported the North, and then Virginia, as we know it today, supported the South. Because of this difference, they actually split into two different states, what you know today as West Virginia and Virginia. The war would last from April 12th, 1861 to April 9th, 1865. The result is a win by the North, but a loss for the country as a whole. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers will die on both the Union and the Confederate side. 360,000 Union soldiers. The Union will be the soldiers who fight for the North, and the Confederate those who fight for the South. When this is over and the South surrenders, led by General Robert E. Lee, they surrendered in Appomattox in Virginia. And when this happens, the North essentially takes over the South. And it starts a period that becomes known as Reconstruction. Meaning to do again, construction to build. So to build again the South. The textbook definition of Reconstruction, you'll see it at the top of the slide, the period during which the United States began to rebuild after the war. So if you look right here, rebuild, it was definitely the North's attempt, or the federal government attempt, to rebuild the South after the Civil War. Now, they would rebuild it to their specifications. The Southerners would see it as the North using them to sometimes make money for their own and only having their interest in mind. The federal government actually passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and the Reconstruction Act of 1867 did not recognize the state governments of the southern states that seceded. Remember, seceding are the states that removed themselves from the Union and fought for the Confederacy. They did not recognize those state governments, so the federal government stepped in and ran those governments. And it divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts. So the South essentially became an area ruled by the military. One of the things that did happen was that the African American men, no, not women, but African American men were granted the right to vote in this Reconstruction Society. And because the South was divided into military districts and the federal troops were in the South, the African Americans did get to vote during this Reconstruction period. People who attempted to intimidate them into not voting, like we would learn about later in U.S. history, weren't there yet because federal troops were still there, preventing that from happening and making sure that schools were being established and also that African American men were given the right to vote. Now, one big piece of the Reconstruction period is when Andrew Johnson is impeached. Now, an impeachment is just when a president is put on trial. It does not mean that he is kicked out of office. A lot of students get confused with that. They think an impeachment is someone's getting kicked out of office, but that is not the case. An impeachment is the trial, and they can be found guilty or not guilty of whatever they are being charged with. Johnson was from Greenville, Tennessee, so he's a native Tennessean. He was the only Southern senator who did not secede from the Union during the Civil War. So he was a supporter of the North during the war. He was a moderate Democrat. He was a running mate in Lincoln's re-election for president of the United States. So he became president after the assassination of Lincoln. Johnson, because Lincoln was a Republican, had problems with the radical Republicans, and many of them saw him too lenient towards Reconstruction, felt like he should be more strict, making sure Southerners do what they want them to do. And so in order to try to catch him and get him in trouble, the Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act. Now, this prevented the president from firing any cabinet members. Now, they knew that Johnson wanted to fire the Secretary of War, but he couldn't do it without approval of the Senate. So when he did fire him, Johnson, quote, suspended him, and Congress took him to trial for violating the Tenure of Office Act. When this happened, Johnson was impeached, and he won by only one vote. So it just kind of goes to show you that America was not completely on a solid foundation after the Civil War. There are a lot of rocky things going on in United States history at the time. So this Reconstruction, this period in which the United States began to rebuild after the Civil War, and it's specifically the South, when you talk about Reconstruction and the North coming in, this Reconstruction society looked different for different people. Many Southerners saw it as ruining the South, ruining their industries. because the Northerners were coming in. Two vocabulary words that you need to be familiar with when you talk about Reconstruction are scallywags and carpetbaggers. Now, a scallywag was a Southern white who supported Reconstruction. If you were a Southerner and you supported Reconstruction, you were seen as someone who was turning their back on the South, as a what is the word I'm looking for? You betrayed your people, and so they called you a scallywag because you supported Reconstruction and the Republican Party. Now, carpetbaggers were Northerners who came into the South during Reconstruction in order to profit from the instability. Many of the people lost lands and homes, and therefore they lost money. And so everything was devalued. Northerners would come in and try to make money off of those people who had lost everything. They were called carpetbaggers because of the bags they carried, which were made out of carpet. Also, during the Reconstruction Society, though, you do start to see the first African American public schools, which you see right here in this lower picture. Sharecropping also existed, and many people say sharecropping is just slightly removed from slavery. So sharecropping would be a white person would own land, divide that land up, and a family, usually an African American family that had previously been slaves, would be allowed to live on a particular parcel of that land. Now, when they lived on that land, they sharecropped, they shared the crops. So to pay rent for that land, they would have to give a portion of their crops to the landowner. Now, let's say it was a bad season and there weren't that many crops, you still had to meet what your owner wanted first. So if you didn't meet that, you might owe them money. If you barely met that, that left nothing for your family. And so these people were really tied to their land and couldn't go anywhere. So that's why many people see it as just slightly removed from slavery. There are 3 amendments that are considered Reconstruction amendments, and these are going to be to the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is the law of the land for the United States. And if the government feels that something should be added or changed to the Constitution that was originally signed, this is called an amendment. And the 3 amendments that are going to be considered Reconstruction amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. Now, they can get kind of wordy, so I'm going to just basically break it down for you a little bit. The 13th Amendment is actually passed or ratified. When you talk about amendment, it's ratified in 1865. And this is a quote from the Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, that means you're not volunteering to do it, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. In 1868, you have the ratification of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So within this amendment, slaves are granted citizenship in the United States of America. And you cannot make laws to deny rights to citizens. So now that African Americans are citizens of the United States, according to the 14th Amendment, you cannot deprive that person of life, liberty, or property. Also, without due process of law. Now, due process is you must respect all the legal rights of a person. Now, you might hear this a lot on TV shows, your due process. That means all legal rights of a person are respected, and that's the 14th. So the 13th Amendment is the outlawing of slavery. The 14th Amendment is the Citizenship Amendment, granting all persons born or naturalized in the United States citizenship, and they're granted those rights that are given in the Constitution, such as life, liberty, property, and due process. The 15th Amendment, I have it broken up into 2 sections. But basically, the 15th Amendment, you cannot be denied the right to vote. So technically, the 15th Amendment says men, not women, have the right to vote. And you would think that after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, African Americans would just get the right to vote. Now, this is the case during Reconstruction, like I said, when those military districts are established and you have troops there. But we're going to talk in a minute how Reconstruction ended and those troops ended, and then people started to intimidate African Americans through things called Jim Crow laws and organizations such as the KKK that kept them from voting. So it reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, that Section 2, you're going to see a lot of that come in when we get into the Civil Rights Movement later in the semester. So, 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. 14th Amendment gives citizenship, saying you have the right to due process, life, liberty, and property. And the 15th Amendment cannot be denied the right to vote. Tennessee would also change because of Reconstruction. Part of Reconstruction is states had to adopt a new constitution, and this new constitution or state constitution had to ban slavery. So in the Constitutional Convention of 1870 in the state of Tennessee, this is going to be the drafting and ratification of that new state constitution for the state of Tennessee, in which they actually abolish slavery and make it illegal in their constitution. It is their way to fit in with the North. It will be Tennessee's third constitution, and it will be written over the course of January through February of 1870. African Americans were elected to political offices after the ratification of this Constitution. You'll see here an image of some of those that were elected to office or the General Assembly. Again, you have to remember we're still under Reconstruction, and so Southern African American males are under the protection of these federal troops that are there to ensure that Reconstruction occurs. Once Reconstruction ends, though, it will change for African Americans. Reconstruction will actually end in the presidential election of 1876, and it all goes down to dirty politics that we often hear of still today. The election was Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican running against Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate. Now, Tilden won the popular vote, but didn't win the majority of the electoral vote. So if you're not familiar with the way the President of the United States is elected, each state gets a number of electoral votes, and the popular vote within that state determines how many of those electoral votes go to each candidate. Now, Tilden actually won the popular vote in the United States, so more people actually voted for him, but he didn't win a majority of the electoral college, which is required in order to be president of the United States. Now, the big issue were 20 electoral votes that existed from 4 different southern states. Florida being one of those, which will also play an issue in the 2000 election with Al Gore and George Bush that we'll get to later in the semester. And so basically what you have happen are Hayes and Tilden politicking for these electoral votes so that they can become president of the United States. Hayes comes up with the plan that most Southerners agree with, and that was that he agreed that if the electoral votes went to him, that he would remove federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. Southerners loved this, thought it was a great idea because then they would be able to do things on their terms, once again without federal troops breathing down their necks, and they would no longer be under military rule. So you have what is known as the Compromise of 1877, and that is the removal of those federal troops. Hayes gets the electoral votes he needs and is elected president of the United States of America. As soon as those federal troops leave, Reconstruction ends, and that election just hastened. Hasten means to quicken the end of Reconstruction. As soon as those federal troops leave, you have what is disenfranchisement begins. Disenfranchisement means to take away the right to vote. Now, even though they are protected by the Constitution, federal troops are there not to protect African Americans and ensure they get that vote. So Southerners start to bend the rules in order to prevent them, African Americans, from voting. So you have a series of laws that are passed that are called Jim Crow laws. They're called Jim Crow laws because Jim Crow was a minstrel show that would go around and he would paint his face black and make fun of the African American community. These Jim Crow laws limited voting by establishing things like poll taxes. So you had to pay a tax in order to vote. Many African Americans couldn't afford this tax, and so they couldn't pay to vote. They also had to take what were known as literacy tests. Literacy is your ability to read. Many African Americans couldn't read, but they would bend the rules for white people. If a white person came in to take the literacy test, they might have a sentence as simple as, just as an example, the cat ran, where a African American might be required to read something out of an encyclopedia or a dictionary. A lot harder to read. The grandfather clause was if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. Well, many of the African Americans, their grandfathers were slaves, and so that excluded them from voting. Again, federal troops not there to enforce it. Also, at the end of Reconstruction, you have what is known as the Exoduster movement, or the Exodus of 1879. This Exoduster movement was a movement of African Americans who moved from the South, migrated or moved to Kansas. One of the leaders of this movement was a former slave from the state of Tennessee named Pap Singleton. Pap Singleton felt that African Americans would never achieve equality in the South, and so he organized the movement of 1,000 African Americans to Kansas.